Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending upon where you are. I'm Mike Sherman, and I'm joined today by Davina Stanley. I've been creating or reading research reports for more decades than I want to count. On client side at P&G, Singtel at Hong Kong Tel, an intermediary between agencies and clients when I was at McKinsey, and at Convey, I helped teams create better reports. Now, Davina and I met when we were office mates at McKinsey, so we've been working on this area for a long time. Davina?
We have. I think for me, more than 20 years.
I got very deeply interested in the topic when I joined Convey. I'd expected to spend most of my time understanding clients' underlying business issues, helping them apply advanced techniques, creating better insights out of the research. And I did that, but I found that often the Convey team had a really outstanding insight or answer to the client's problems, but they failed to communicate it in the way that the client understood and could act on. So I actually spent a lot of my time on this topic, creating better research reports. So that led to my doing this work and to today's topic. So we'd like you to remember three things at the end. First off, clients aren't happy and we don't realize it. And we're going to give you some new data that shows that. Second, that reports are too long and they lack a clear answer to clients' business issues. And third, that one of the solutions to that is preparing concise, synthesized reports that will improve client satisfaction and, by the way, your productivity. So this is not a new issue. In the 1990s, the ARF did a survey, and CEOs said that market research was the least valued of all the business information they received. And that's unfortunate because we in this industry understand that understanding the customer can be valuable. But it continues to be a problem. So in 2019, working with Ray and Sue of NewMR and Neil Gaines of Tapestry Works, we did a survey, and only 30% of people who received reports, and this could be someone at a client, an end user, or an intermediary, only 30% of them said the report was very good or excellent. This summer, we repeated the survey, and it's slightly better, so it's 36%, but still only about a third of people are saying that they're getting good reports. What makes this particularly important is, going back to 2019, people who create reports don't realize this. Because when you ask them the same question, right, there's a 37-point gap between their top two box, that is people who create reports, and the people who receive them. So this is 2019, it was a 37-point gap. And when we repeated the exercise this summer, it's a 33-point gap. So despite our being an industry that says we should be listening to our customers, right, we're not listening to our customers because they're not happy with the quality of the research reports.
And I think what was really interesting with the research that Mike was doing, I thought it was a fabulously simple way of getting some evidence for my own work in working with people in corporates of all kinds around communicating complex ideas. And so I conducted the research in my own community and found that, asking those who receive reports, the audience, or authors, those who prepare them when they're preparing substantial communication, what their reactions were, and the results were broadly the same. And I think it's really interesting that there's such a gap around what they see as being good, but the inverse is true around what they see is poor. Those who are communicating, the authors, are much less likely to rank their communication as poor, whereas the audience here is, 5 times more likely to suggest that the communication is poor. So I thought that was just a really interesting match with the work that Mike had been doing. I thought that was quite intriguing, actually.
So it's not just market research that has this issue, but market research does have this issue.
Exactly. It's a really common human issue, I think. Yeah.
So on to our second report. Why aren't they happy? Well, when we asked people, they said reports are too long and they don't give an answer. Now, what's interesting is that both people who receive and create reports agree that the most important thing is to be insightful. The second most important thing is to be concise. Third is practical. Right? Detailed and rigorous come much lower. So this is what people are telling us. And they agree between people who write and receive. But obviously we have a problem because that's not the output.
So what's really interesting is to understand what's going on in people's minds between those who receive the information and those who create it. Our biology gets in the way. And that's because if we think of it at a very, very primal, very simple level, our brains are 2% of our body weight, whereas they burn 20% of our calories. So there's quite a disconnect there. And it becomes quite a natural thing for our bodies without even us really realizing it, to actually make a decision as to what they're going to invest in and not. So if something is really difficult to understand and requires a lot of energy to actually understand, our bodies are almost hijacking us to say, well, are we going to invest in understanding this or not? And if it's too difficult, certainly when I talk with my clients, they just say, oh, I'll just park it for later. I won't read that. I won't invest the time to really, dig in and understand what's going on. If it's too hard, I just won't do it. Whereas equally, when we're preparing the reports, it's really easy for us to send information out without thinking too hard about it, because it is us fighting our own biology. So that comes to play on both sides of the equation, both on the writer and the receiver's side, if you like. Our human wiring gets in the way of both creating and receiving that sort of information.
So what does this wiring lead to? Well, here are some 3 bad but common examples. I call it the War and Peace report, which has every possible chart cut every particular way. And the answer is somewhere buried inside the report, but it's very hard to find. My second bad example is the data drop report, which is just tables and tables and tables with no executive summary. And my favorite example, I call the Agatha Christie report. Oops. Agatha Christie, as most of you should know, and hopefully you've read some of her books, she's a mystery writer, and she doesn't tell you who done it until the last page. A business report should not be an Agatha Christie report. A business report should give you the answer on the first page, up front, right? You don't want to be romanced. A business executive is short of time. And as Davina just said, biologically, they just want something short and to the point. They don't want to go through the complexity. So you don't want the Agatha Christie report. You don't want the answer at the end. These are not new problems. This is from 2005 in SMR, the Global Market Research Society. And this is an article on reporting. And lady from Philips said, people are uncomfortable with clear, concise recommendations. And despite there being longstanding problems, right, they still are problems. So when we ask people what makes a good report or why wasn't the last report good, and this is among people receiving reports, they said they're too long, right? They're long, there are too many slides, difficult navigation, too long to be truly accessible. Many quotes on it was too long. Next page. They lacked insights, right? I just didn't understand what the so what was, right? The recommendation didn't speak to the key challenges we're facing, and only report the findings but can't interpret the data. So they lack insights. And finally, right, they want answers, right? What's the most important thing for making a report excellent? Again, this is people receiving reports. They want answers to business issues. They want a point of view. They want clear action steps. So this is what the people who receive reports are saying they want. So how do you give it to them? You prepare concise, synthesized reports that make for happier clients, and as Davina will talk in a minute, also can make you more productive.
It's an interesting thing, actually. I was speaking with a client yesterday, and we were talking about this process, and they're implementing it in their own world. And they said that front-ending the thinking, which is what I'm going to encourage you to think about, actually saved them a whole lot of time at the writing stage. So having a planning and mapping stage at the beginning of their work did give them quite a bit of time back. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And I think before I get into the how, I'd just like to demonstrate with an example here so you can see the difference between 2 different examples. And I might just go back a moment. So there's just one on the screen there. This is an example of an email that went out to customers. And it used a strategy that I see quite a lot where the question is highlighted. rather than actually what the message is trying to convey. And you can see that this is actually quite long. I've got it there. It's over 2 pages. It was 640 words. So in your world, that might be still quite short. I do understand a lot of your communication might be longer than that, but I just wanted something to illustrate. And so here we've got some topics and we've got a single message, which is a question. It's not actually the insight that the audience needs. But then when we did some work on this example to work out what are they trying to achieve here, what's really going on, we said actually what they're really trying to say is we're doing everything we can to help you shop while keeping safe. And this is a COVID type story, hence the safety message. And then we've got a set of points here saying, well, what is it we're actually doing? And it's, you know, significantly shorter. There's less than 50% of the number of words, less than half the length. And yet the message is so much more impactful. So I wanted to show you this as an example that's just easy to demonstrate on a screen, that you might think about, you know, using a different strategy to bring a really strong story, a strong message that matches the insight that your audience needs from you into your reporting, and in fact all sorts of communication that you might have with your clients along your engagement with them. And to do that, we're really thinking about what is the outcome that we want to achieve, not just what are we putting into the process, what are the inputs. And I think this is one of Mike's favorite quotes, you know, people don't want drills, they want a 1/4-inch hole. And, you know, just thinking really very carefully about why does our client want this information? Why does our audience need to know this? Rather than, you know, we're going to deliver them a report. You know, what does the report achieve? What does the communication achieve? Whatever format that communication is in. I think that's a really, really useful way to think about it. And so part of that is being able to make sure you can convey your message really quickly. So just imagine yourself being in the elevator and being able to deliver, you know, 3 points. Here's the main issue. Here's what we think the answer is going to be. That's our hypothesis. And here's what we think you should do about it. And then you can imagine as you leave the elevator, the audience is going, oh my gosh, can we just stand here and talk about that a bit more? That's really interesting. Rather than giving them so much background data that they're trying to sort through it all and, you know, fighting against their biology to actually understand what you're trying to say, you've intrigued them by being a little bit provocative, even by giving them what you think the main insight is from your story. And because you've done that, you can convey it really quickly as well. And what you're wanting them to do is saying, wow, that's really great. I love that. You know, can you tell me more about that? Or how do I implement that as sort of their response, rather than this business of having to do the analysis and the thinking themselves that perhaps in their mind they've paid you to do. So if we're thinking about how do we actually go about that, I've got a PowerPoint. I understand quite a lot of your reports are delivered in PowerPoint format. And so I've got an example here of a story, which is reasonably complicated at the deeper level, but actually just conveyed here at the high level, where we've got a single slide at the beginning with our title, our main message, a little bit of background just to indicate what we're talking about here. And then on page 3 there, we've got the high level of the entire story tied together with one idea. This is our one message. And then in this case, 3 points that support it. And then the next 3 pages there unpack each one of those points in a bit more detail. And you can have perhaps more pages per section when your report's a whole lot longer than that. But the whole idea that you'd anchor the whole story around some high-level messages that have real value to your client is where we're driving at here. So I think the key thing, and we're thinking about, well, how do we get to that? One of the strategies to help us save time is to make a straw man around what our message is, and do that quite early in the process. And I'll give you an example of exactly what that means in just a moment. But the idea is to say at a high level, with what we know today, partway through our journey, here's what we think the answer is. We've got it as a single message and then unpacked into as much detail as we need. You can imagine this being sticky notes on a wall or something like that on a whiteboard. It doesn't have to be fancy. Just what is our main message? What do we think we're saying here? It's not about writing the report early. It's just about clarifying our message, our insight early. And the reason they could change the way their working dynamic happened was that they stopped doing what I've got here at the top. They stopped working out what the story was till the very end. So in a way which I suspect many of you are doing too, is we're doing what we call the old time envelope, where you do lots of analysis and you keep doing your analysis until you think you've finished, right to just before you deliver the report. And then you start to draw out the messages and you develop your communication material. So you're spending the vast bulk of your time on the analysis as a discrete chunk. And then at the very end, you're doing your communication, thinking about your messaging and so on. Whereas a different way of thinking about that is to say, we've got to be doing our analysis the whole way along. We've got to get it all done. We've got to have that absolutely done. But what we ought to do, oh, bear with me, my mouse just jumped. Bear with me, I'll come back. What we can do is think about what our storyline might look like, what our messaging might look like quite early in the process. Like I said, in rough draft form, not in anything fancy or concrete or beautifully written, just sticky notes on a whiteboard or hand-drawn boxes and thoughts on a whiteboard or on a notepad. It doesn't have to be fancy, but just having that thought process moving forward. What does this analysis mean? What is the question we're asking? What is the message we need to convey? What have we found here, and how will that be helpful to the client? What's the real value here? And deliver that as a single message. And then, of course, we can test it as we continue to finish our analysis. But having that basic structure, potentially very early on, but then, getting to a place well before the end of our assignment, where we can test that story, perhaps with the client director, and say, we think this is what the messaging is. Does that resonate with you? Does that sound right? And then start pulling the architecture for the communication together and validating, rather than necessarily leaving it all to the scramble at the very end. Can be a really helpful way to do it. And by doing that, we end up saving ourselves lots of time and reducing the rework around the whole document, because that architecture around the document has been agreed. The thinking around it has been progressed quite a bit earlier on as a hypothesis that needs to be tested, not necessarily, set in stone, but a hypothesis as to what we think the messaging might be. So we've found that to be, universally really, really powerful. And so I guess that was the key thing that we wanted to cover here. And Mike, I'm sure you've got extra things you want to add before we head on into the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Davina. So just to summarize, right, clients aren't happy. They're far less satisfied with the reports than we who create them are. One of the contributors to that is that they're too long and they lack a solution focus. And as Davina just took you through, a concise, synthesized report can improve client satisfaction and improve your productivity. One ending comment before we go to Q&A is the title of this was focusing on the solution and not the story. Stories aren't bad. Davina has used that wording as she goes through it, but they are a vehicle for delivering a solution, delivering insight to the client. What I have seen, and the reason why I wrote the title as such, is people thinking about the story as the end result. And I even had one webinar where someone said the story was important. If it didn't have a clear conclusion, that was okay, as long as it was a memorable story. Not true. Right? You need to give people an answer. Right? And by the way, sometimes it's not a traditional story. One of my favorite reports, so to speak, was a presentation, and there was a new product development, and they had 2 hours booked with the head of marketing. And he walked in at the beginning and he said, I don't have the 2 hours, I have to go to another meeting. And he looked at the key researcher, Simon Duval-Kiefer of Ipsos, if he happens to be on this webinar. And he asked Simon, so what should I do? And Simon had done his work and he knew what his answer was. And he said, launch. The client said, thank you, and walked out of the room. A one-word report. Right? Now, he actually walked in a few minutes later and said, I want to hear some of the details, but I wanted to make sure that you were on the same wavelength that I was. I have a decision to make. I wanted you to help me make that decision. I didn't want a lot of story without a conclusion. So thank you for your time. If you want more on this material, both Davina and I have written books. Mine, this is a chapter in the book, and Davina's is all about the so what strategy. You can get both of them on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. So with that, let us move to Q&A.